Hello, I'm Cam, a game development educator at Macquarie University. I'm presenting some ongoing work that I'm doing with the MQ Game Jam, an extracurricular activity with pedagogical consideration. I'm going to present lessons I've learned to help anyone thinking of doing or who are currently doing something similar. Now, like many of you who teach game design and development, our students have a big project at the end of their degree. Students start with the concept for the game and they go through the whole design and development lifecycle all the way to publishing a game right at the end. But students haven't had the experience of seeing a game from go to woe yet. They've done a lot of scaffolded, smaller projects to learn the ropes, and there's a huge leap from that to publishing something for other people to play. As such, they encounter problems that they haven't faced before. There's technical debt, there's overscope design coming to roost, and features or interfaces that aren't being tested until it's way too late. These are great learning opportunities, we all know that, but students don't see it that way when their grades are at stake. University degrees are expensive, they're stressful, and punishing someone for getting something wrong the first time is problematic. So that's problem number one, but kind of speaks to our next problem. The relationship between the games industry and game development in academia. There are a lot of questions around how industry-focused game development degrees should be, especially given the nature of the industry. These questions are hardly unique to game development, with the divide between higher education's focus on theoretical pursuits and the more practical approach of vocational education and training coming under scrutiny. Finding avenues within degrees to teach industry preparedness versus critical thinking provides its own challenges. Many work-ready teaching practices reinforce established inequalities, marginalizing the already marginalized and reducing student outcomes. Moreover, an overemphasis on project-based learning, a necessity for creating complete video games, can privilege the doing rather than the understanding and problem solving. A gravitation away from the creation of thoughtful, well-rounded problem solvers seems perpendicular to a university's mission. Now, an alternative approach is community readiness, and this resonates as a really attractive compromise between the industry focus of many universities in the 2020s and our own reckoning here in Australia as to the games industry being one of craft and entrepreneurship. Community is our first clue for approaching the problems I've outlined. Ingraining community building and knowledge sharing into programming pedagogy has precedent. Although rather different in execution, Zalia's et al.'s work encourages educators to expose students to open source communities and encourage contributions. Now, while useful, our students range in skill and confidence, and placing too much at stake for the student, grades, public scrutiny, contributing to a big deal open source project they're passionate about, these won't really help alleviate my central concern of students feeling like they're making mistakes too late. So how have we tried to address this? We've created an extracurricular game jam event. 2 days, students get together, they make a game based on a theme and a constraint. However, in addition to these basic tenets of a game jam, we also introduce assessment tasks, finding a group, creating a pitch to present and publish the final game. These are all framed in familiar classroom language and scaffolding, but without any marks associated with them. Separate from both grades and class time, the game jams capitalize on the concept of extracurricular activities for student learning, an approach in programming and STEM education discussed by Dalal et al. The game jams began as really small affairs, but have since grown to a prominent event within the university, welcoming students from across different degrees, faculties, and even institutions. This was a teaching exercise, so I wasn't really planning on doing any research. As such, none of these game jams were running away where it would be ethical for me to use participant data or images. So instead, I'll be discussing my experience as an educator and a facilitator of these events through an auto-ethnographic lens. So there's a lot of lessons that I've learned, but I've only really got time for 3. Engagement with industry, structure versus chaos, and student well-being. For the first game jam, I didn't involve industry at all. I didn't know how things were going to go, how many students would turn up, and I didn't want to really do my growing up in front of industry here, you know. My nerves perhaps worked in my favor here, because when I did invite industry later on for the second game jam, I contacted what was then Wargaming Sydney, and I just kind of said, hey, look, I'm just a funky little guy, I'm running a funky little game jam, would you like to help? You know, you can help in any way you want, you can send people to hang out, you can judge the games, it's how much you want to give and how much you can afford to give. And they said, yep, cool, we're going to send you 2 staff, Holly Hawkins and Luke Ledwick, both amazing people. They came in, they did these great little presentations about design and about game jams, and then they spent both days just walking around, helping students, writing code, generally being incredible people. And Holly and Luke have both been mainstays of the game jam, but then the next time I invited industry, I also got Mitch Sayer from Blowfish, and he's done much the same thing. You know, he did his presentation, and then he's walking around helping out. And these folks, all three of them, they're coming back to game jams. They're remembering students from previous game jams. They're picking up conversations from a year before. It's been amazing. And I do think part of why this has worked is because I wasn't prescriptive to the guests. Had I told them, hey, look, you have to do X, Y, Z, they might not have been quite as open and quite as generous with their time. But because I allowed them to craft their role and their involvement, they've taken a lot more ownership of it. So engagement with industry is great, but it should be a co-op experience. So on to my next point around structure and chaos. This is really positioned as an extracurricular activity, right? It's still within the context of their degree, and so they're still trusting us to be their teachers. Our most recent game jam was probably the most structured of all, predicated on previous jam observations. Something I introduced this time around was asking participants to self-nominate their roles when registering. So developer, designer, producer, artist. In previous game jams, we'd end up with games made by a team of 4 programmers. So they make a game that works really well, but it isn't any fun, it doesn't have any interesting level design, that kind of thing. So that was the structure, but the chaos there is that, we didn't really say to students, hey, look, you need a team of 1 developer, 1 designer, 1 whatever. Setting those constraints suggests that there's only one way to make a game, and also doesn't account for the fact that, we'll have students who don't neatly fit in all of those roles. Instead, I encourage the use of these labels as conversation starters, allowing students to audit their group as they formed it. Now, structure that emerged independent of me is that students began to form teams around their skill levels, and this was kind of bubbling up throughout each game jam, I think. Many teams would be formed by a third-year student who would kind of look around and get this kind of motley crew of first and second years together, and these third-year students became the producers. They shepherded and guided the students working with them. Now, in terms of a temporal structure, I did try to keep this light. The day begins with a short talk from myself and the industry guests, where we go over a few design and development lessons around game jams. The purpose of this is to treat the game jam itself and the ensuring deliverable the same way one might any other assessment. When you ask your students to write an essay, you do some essay writing skills. When you ask them to make a game over the course of a semester, you set up what that looks like, right? And so with the game jam, that's important. Having that same kind of scaffolding, that same kind of modeling. The main lessons I've tried to present to students are form a team of diverse folk, work with people you haven't before. You might meet your new best friend, you might meet your new collaborator. Take breaks, respect those around you, publish a web build at the end. The main reason for that last one was just keep them focused on one platform release rather than testing in many different environments on different devices. Now, a lot of these are kind of hidden curriculum ideas. They're less about the design thinking that we teach in class, and indeed what the industry folk are bringing to the table, and more about how to actually find and work with those around you. That's not to say that design lessons weren't peppered throughout me speaking to groups throughout the day, but I tried to emphasize and focus on ideas that we often expect of students in the classroom without having it explicitly translated into the curriculum. So from here, students were given 2 more assignments or milestones, if you like. An end of day 1 presentation with a high concept, as well as what was accomplished that day, what they were going to do the next day. And then at the end of day 2, presenting the game in this big lecture hall with everyone around to support and clap and cheer. And I think we had at one point 16 controllers plugged in for one of the games. And other than that, and well, I guess kind of with that in terms of the 16 controllers, we embrace the chaos, right? Students collaborate, they take walks around campus, they go to one of the many rooms we've booked out, they play each other's games, they chill outside the labs, eating the pizza and the snacks. And I think that is important because too often we get students into third year where we adopt this kind of more studio-based learning approach, and it's very jarring for students because everything before that has been really intensely prescribed to them through lesson structure for good reason. By the time they get to that studio environment, they don't really know what to do with this time. They're waiting for someone to direct them. So speaking to this structure, our game jam structure borrows quite heavily from the 4 steps of studio-based learning as outlined by Reardon and Tanji. A meaningful problem is given to students, that is to make a game, fitting our theme and constraint. How they get there is up to them. Each day, students present their solutions, their games, and they justify how they met that theme. Other students give feedback and comments on the game, sometimes getting to play it. And finally, students are able to rework their games before the next submission. And I guess that kind of openness and that tension of chaos and structure brings me to my final point around student well-being. Timing is important for an extracurricular activity. We had this real aversion to running the game jam after the exam period because our belief was that most students were going home, they're going back to work, they're done with uni for the semester or for the year. So we always tried to find good times to run the jam, such as during reading weeks, but then students have an assignment due, so we thought, okay, well, let's schedule it for the final week of exams, because there are never exams booked during the final week of exams. But there were exams booked during the final week of exams, and it was an awful idea. So with the most recent game jam, we ran it actually after the exam period, and we had our biggest turnout yet. Regardless, there are going to be well-being issues, in the sense that making a game is stressful, and things go wrong. Students won't necessarily listen to what I have to say, which is maybe it's reasonable. They also won't listen to what industry veterans have to say, which is less reasonable. And then when they get to the end, their build doesn't work, the controller breaks when presenting in front of the crowd. These are all those lessons that they used to learn at the end of their degree. But it's not too bad now, because they're surrounded by their friends, and I give them an extra 48 hours to polish the game before submitting it to the judging panel. So rather than creating their first complete game in the final year of study, experiencing the woes that come with it while their GPAs are on the line, they instead do so surrounded by friends, pizza, encouraging industry guests. The game jam activity becomes this really valuable but risk-free milestone on their journey from student to developer, and helps dismantle the idea that students must first complete their degrees before being game makers. To sum it up, like your first research paper, your first punk song, or your first Sonic the Hedgehog fanfiction, your first game is gonna suck. You're gonna make mistakes, things are going to break, and the end product might not even work at all. By making students experience this in the final chapter of their degrees in game development, we're setting them up for an early game over. Through extracurricular activities like game jams with applied pedagogical practices, we can give our students extra lives. While I've been leading the efforts discussed in this paper, the game jam is more than just me, and it only happens thanks to a lot of support from other folk at the university. Here are some of the amazing folk that have contributed to the game jam in some way. Here are my references. I don't just make stuff up. Future Cameron will be live in the Q&A. So woohoo! See you there.